newspaper articles which are going to be very important, very significant for the civil services examination. So let's start with the first important newspaper article. Now this particular newspaper article talks about the data regarding the exports and imports, that is exim data, right? Now there's some of the corrections which have been brought forward from April 2022 to November 2022 data, right? And this article becomes important for the GS paper 3, that is Indian economy and issues relating to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. Let's first understand the context of this particular newspaper article. Let's analyze that particular data, and then we are going to understand the important terms which are hidden in this particular newspaper article. So this article talks about the fact that India's foreign trade data for the first 8 months of 2022 to 2023, that is April to November 2022, have been significantly revised, with the import bill being scaled up or down by at least $2 billion in each of these months in comparison to the preliminary estimates issued by the Union Commerce Ministry. And if you look at the data, then trade balance is basically it is the trade balance, right? Now the initial estimates for the April, for example, of the trade balance was 20,110. Then now it has been revised to 18,360. In the similar fashion, in all of the months the data has been revised, and in totality from April to November the trade balance is minus 195,174. Earlier it was minus 205,070, right? Now this particular revision has been done. Now let's first understand what is trade balance, then we will understand what is the trade deficit, what is trade surplus. We are also going to understand what is current account deficit. But before that, what's significant is that this particular revision or these kinds of revision pose a different kind of problem. Now the problem lies in the fact that we are not able to make good policies. If you don't actually know the data, then it is very difficult to formulate the policies, especially when a critical focus area for the economy is managing the current account deficit. Now at this particular point of time, current account deficit is fueled due to rising imports, and there is a fear of slowdown in the exports amid a global recession. So if we can't formulate very strong policies, then this will lead to India getting into recession. That is the trouble which the economists face at this particular point of time, right? So these were some of the estimates regarding it and some of the problems. Let's now understand the important terms. So the first important term is the trade balance. So trade balance is nothing but the difference between the country's export value and its import value over the period of time. Mathematically, you can say that trade balance is equal to exports minus imports, and that is why we have seen minus. When you see it in minus terms, as we have seen in this particular data, that from April to November it is minus 195,174, right? So this is basically trade deficit. So if the value of the imports exceed exports, the country experiences a negative trade balance. When we have a higher number of exports and lower imports, then it is a trade surplus. Now the another important term we encountered in this particular newspaper article is current account deficit. Now what is current account deficit? Deficit in the current account. What does current account do? Current account keeps in mind all the trade that is happening, right? So the deficit in it means that the value of the goods and services it imports has exceeded the value of the products it exports, right? Now the reasons behind the current account deficits are many, but we can boil it down into two types of causes, or the causes of the current account deficit. First one is the structural change, structural cause, and the second one is the cyclical cause. Now the structural cause is that now the current account deficit can arise due to underinvestment. It can also It can also come due to the relatively low productivity. We also have persistently high relative inflation. Then also the current account deficit is going to be there. Apart from it, inadequate research and development, innovation, and emergence of lower cost competition also lead to current account deficits. Now there are some of the cyclical reasons due to the market factors as well. For example, we have the overvalued exchange rate. Whenever the value of the exchange rate is going to be overvalued, then we will encounter the current account deficit. And boom in the domestic demand is also going to lead to current account deficit. Recession in the key exports market will lead to current account deficits. Slump in the global prices of the exports will also lead to current account deficit. Increased demand for the imported technology will also lead to current account deficit. Now the current account deficit is not very bad if the government takes policies in order to import the raw material and export all of the finished goods, then that is a good current account deficit. What's bad current account deficit is when we supply the raw materials and we import the finished goods. That is very detrimental to the economy of any kind of country. So this is what is current account deficit, which is basically the when the this situation arises when the value of the goods and services, that is the imports, exceed that of the exports, right? So this is it regarding this particular newspaper article. Let's now head to the next important newspaper article. Now this particular newspaper article talks about a study which has been published in the global environmental challenge, and it says that transition from the non-renewable sources of energy to renewable sources of energy poses a risk for India. How it poses the risk? We'll talk about it in this particular newspaper article. Now, this particular newspaper article is important for the GS paper 3, that is conservation, environmental pollution and degradation, environmental impact assessment. Let's first understand the context of it, and then we will deep dive into what are the major pointers in this particular study, which was published on Global Environmental Challenge Journal, right? Now, India's financial sector is highly exposed to the risk of the economy transitioning from being largely dependent on the fossil fuel to clean energy, says a study which was published in the Global Environmental Challenge Journal last week. Now, this particular study says that this particular study analyzed individual loans and bonds when how the finances are being provided to all of the sectors. Now, this particular study found that 60% of the lending to the was going to the mining sector, and which was basically mining of oil and gas extraction, while 1/5 of the manufacturing sector debt is for petroleum refining and related industry. Now, electricity production, by far the largest source of carbon emissions, accounted for 5.2% of outstanding credit, but only 17.5% of this lending is pure play renewables. Now, this is a very less amount according to the authors, and this particular problem arises to the lack of awareness among the financial institution. So there was a shortage of experts in India's financial institutions who had the expertise to appropriately advise the institutions on such a transition from non-renewable sources of energy to renewable sources of energy. They lacked information regarding it. All the financial advisors, officers, they lacked information regarding it. Now, fewer than half of the 154 finance professionals surveyed were familiar with the environmental issues, including climate change mitigation and adaptation, greenhouse gas emissions, or transition risk. And only 4 of 10 major financial institutions surveyed collect information on environmental, social, and governance risk, and these firms do not systematically incorporate that data into the financial planning. If you don't financially plan it in order to give the money to the renewable sources of energy, all the sectors which are producing the renewable energy, then how are you going to get the finances? For example, in 2021, the Prime Minister of our country committed India to reach net zero emissions by 2070. Now, it is not going to happen out of thin air. We need finances for it. So, India also announced plans to source half of its electricity needs from the non-fossil fuel sources by 2030. And this is not going to happen out of thin air. We need finances out of it. However, the country has also maintained that it needs a financing in order to of at least $1 trillion to meet these commitments. Now, this particular money is coming out of will come out of the financial institutions, but the financial institutions seem not to commit regarding this particular sector because they do not have the systems in places in order to get that kind of or give that kind of finances. So, mapping India's policy commitments against these lending and investment patterns reveals that India's financial sector is heavily exposed to potential transition risks, right? And apart from it, we also know that coal sector and all of these sectors such as oil extraction, these are very capital intensive businesses, right? And at this particular point of time, they are in a high amount of debt, and this particular thing is also a problem, right? Now, the authors also give some kind of solutions to it. For example, the financial institutions will need to ramp up their capacities relatively quickly as the RBI led momentum further picks up. At this particular point of time, India is expected to launch its first ever sovereign green bonds, which are basically going to help in the climate change mitigation, right? So, with Reserve Bank of India expected to launch a 5 and 10-year green bonds worth $40 billion, it is very important for the financial institutions to keep up the pace with the Reserve Bank of India's sovereign green bonds as well. And India's presidency of the G20 also means a focus on the energy transition and mobilizing sustainable finance, because we are a pioneer in the field of the renewable sources of energy. We have the International Solar Alliance, and that is why we are needed to focus upon this particular transition, and that is not going to happen out of the thin air, and this is what we need to keep in our mind. And financial institutions need to be more aware of these kinds of changes. So this is it regarding this particular newspaper article, and this is it for the day. Thank you from my side. Do like and share the video and subscribe to this channel. Have a good day. Bye.